These are heady times in Alberta. Despite persistent talk of separation over its frustrations with Ottawa, the province has been making news in recent weeks. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has unveiled two major pipeline proposals, announced a $4.6 billion natural gas power plant, and secured Meta's $13 billion commitment to build what is expected to become Canada's largest data center. Here to talk about all of that and the bigger story behind it is Falice Chin. She is Alberta Bureau Chief for the Hub. Falice, thanks so much for joining us today. Great to have you with us.
Pleased to be here.
Thank you. Okay, Falice, you have worked in the media here in Alberta for many years, and after all of Premier Smith's blusters about Ottawa holding Alberta Energy hostage, how surprised were you by this rash of announcements?
Well, it's pretty surprising if you look at just, that string of things you just mentioned, and then you play that against, rewind the tape a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
It's a total tonal shift in every way possible, not just in the substance of what is being accomplished, but also the smiles that are on the faces of all of these leaders, the incredible alignment across two different levels of government, and then also just what the political landscape even looks like right now. Who are the parties saying all of these things? It is an insane kind of sequence of events. And if I was a betting man, 18 months ago, there was no way I would have predicted this kind of outcome.
Right. I mean, you have written about it in an article recently about how the conversation has changed so much. Like going back 18 months, like you said, it was a much different story then. I think back then, Smith was widely portrayed as a premier isolated from her colleagues and sort of battling Ottawa over energy policy and U.S. relations and everything else.
People were throwing around the T word, traitor. Who doesn't remember that infamous photo op of Danielle Smith shaking hands with Donald Trump, right? At Mar-a-Lago, no less. This is right after his many 51st state rhetoric and all the tariff threats against the U.S. But you also have to recall that Premier's meeting, where this was one of the last few days when Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister, and he called a First Minister's meeting to think about all the ways we could retaliate. And Smith notably boycotted or was absent from that meeting. On top of that, she issued a pretty provocative statement saying she can't go along with this strategy where Alberta's biggest contribution in terms of exports, that's just a fact. Energy exports are number one sector. And that you can't throw this sector under the bus for the sake of retaliation. And at the time, she, earned much criticism for that stance. And it felt like she was the premier outside looking in. Fast forward 18 months, we have a different prime minister. We've had many different talks about the MOU, the energy deal, what our relationship is with the U.S. And we've come to this incredible alignment where, maybe it's the best thing we can get from the BC Premier, which is no opposition, perhaps. Not endorsement, but at least he's not going to challenge the pipeline idea. You've got the Premier of Ontario saying we're going to study the feasibility of a pipeline to Sarnia. And even some of the other premiers who are not directly involved in what we're talking about right now, whether we're talking about Wild Canoe in Manitoba or Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, everyone's singing from the same songbook. And so taken together, if you look at if you're an investor from afar, from a different country, and thinking about investing in Canada, 18 months ago, you'd be like, what is this country about? Because it seems like the different parties, the different levels of government have different ideas about what it is that we want to accomplish. Right now, at least, it seems like they're all saying the same thing.
Right. Yeah. Many of them sort of speaking the same language. Right. And you mentioned, Felice, Ontario. Ontario's Doug Ford. So he's now on board. And Ford and Smith announcing this development of that pipeline to the east. So how significant is that?
Probably more so symbolically than in substance, I would say. Right now, that is at a very, very, very early stage, not to be confused with the West Coast pipeline, which is much further along and now with the hands of the major projects office, right? So that one has gone through a lot more stress testing, one should say. But, this is more of just like an alignment of values more than anything. I think the fact that the two premiers are willing to say, look, this is something that we have in common, that we can work together towards, signals to investors, to, the broader, trying to project a broader message of stability in the country that Canada can work again. And what's notable, I would say, is how much of this is Alberta centric. If we're looking at the stories that are driving headlines. Obviously, today we've got the tariff threats coming from Trump coming back in full force. Who knew the World Cup FIFA Peace Prize was holding it all together? Now that that's all over, the tariff threats are back again. But, look beyond the day-to-day headlines. And it's notable how many stories about Canada are Alberta driven, Alberta forward. And that makes sense because we have been the economic engine of this country for so long. Much of that dissatisfaction you mentioned earlier about all the talks around separation has been because there was this asymmetry of power that didn't reflect the asymmetry of economic power in this country. And so when there's a misalignment of power versus economic output, it results in a lot of resentment that is driven by these economic issues rather than, say, Quebec, where it's a lot of it is cultural.
Mm-hmm. Felice, you wrote that Alberta's agenda has gone national. So explain that for us a little bit.
It's sort of what I just alluded to. The priorities of wanting to maximize what we have to give to the world, what the world wants from us, if we're talking about not just profitability, which really matters because we're talking about royalties and taxes. These are huge contributors to our economy. But beyond that, what is it that Canada is trying to do on the world stage? The Prime Minister has talked about middle powers and the need to help our allies. How do we actually do that? Well, we don't have a giant army or even a big air force. Our role is supplying the materials, the raw materials oftentimes, that the world needs and to our allies, right? And so you can't avoid the subject of energy and what role that plays. As I mentioned, that is our biggest export sector. That is the one thing that everyone wants from Canada. And when we're talking about energy, it's not just for combustibles. We're not just talking about gasoline and diesel. These are feedstocks for a whole lot of things that the world needs, including parts for EVs, asphalt that the EVs drive on, and all the petrochemicals, the clothing that we're wearing. We're talking through screens right now. All of these things involve critical minerals and energy. And so these are the things that Alberta has been saying for a long time. And right now, that is dominating our trade and foreign policy.
Right. Yeah. Instead of criticizing Ottawa's economic vision. I guess Smith has been presenting one of her own, like you said, built around energy. So is this savvy politics then on Smith's part, or just are the stars just aligning right now?
Well, it's the reality that the main barrier is no longer on, right? You can't help it but to point that out if that is the entity that's erecting policy after policy that altogether create more uncertainty for a sector's future. And Premier Smith is far from the first premier to take that tactic of being opposed to Ottawa and making that the centerpiece of her political messaging. Everyone from Rachel Notley to Ralph Klein have full versions of this. Some of them more gentle than others, some of them, more pointed than others. But that opposition, it has formed so much of the Alberta identity for good reason. It comes from a place of true frustration that, the center of power continues to be centralized in the middle of the country, central Canada, the Laurentian elites, if you will, some might say. And that has created this unevenness across the country. We haven't talked about the political asymmetry yet. There remains things that probably will need to be resolved over time, which involve political representation, the Senate, even equalization, for example. But at least on the exports and the economic front, there is a recognition that something needs to be done to refocus how we go about doing these things. And so I think, right now, there is an acknowledgement of that latter piece I just mentioned. And that, by getting out of the way, so to speak, or maybe not even getting out of the way, creating extra pieces that allow us to go around the existing policies, that has done a lot in ameliorating relationships between the West and Ottawa.
Yeah. And, we can't forget also lately there's been this growing threat of Alberta separation. So how much has this separation talk played into this Alberta moment?
I can't imagine it hasn't played a role. We know from some of the reporting out there that Carney did invoke it to his caucus, saying, do you really want to be the party in charge when the country breaks, right? And so others, people even like Jason Kenney, have been quite critical of this approach, calling it a knife to the throat kind of tactic. If you spend enough time in Alberta, you inevitably hear Albertans talk about how Quebec has it so good and why Quebec gets its way. And people will inevitably invoke the idea of separation. But it's because Quebec threatens to separate, why they get all of these concessions. Whether that is like the main piece of why this is happening, you can't argue with the fact that it works. And I'm not saying that to put more fuel to the fire here. I'm just merely pointing out something that Albertans have been obsessed with for a long, long time. And some version of it is moving forward, and it has impacted the national conversation.
We are out of time here, but Falice, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Falice Chin is the Alberta Bureau Chief for The Hub.